Today we occasionally hear talk about nihilism, the nihilism of modern society, or the lapse of traditional values. People struggle with the lack of meaning in their lives. Indeed, perhaps some of you have experienced the same phenomenon in one form or another in the context of your own society or life. Why is this such a widespread modern problem? In the past, it was thought that the universe was not all that large and that the earth was at its center. It occupied a special place, and God had created it for a special purpose. Human beings like you and me played a special role in this. We were part of God's plans and were favored among all the creatures of the world. People in those days, of course, were well aware of the difficulties and contingencies of life. They knew disease, suffering, and death. But in the face of this, it was a great comfort to think that the earth was an absolutely unique and special place that God was personally interested in. God cared about the fate and struggles of families and individuals. After a long period of historical and scientific development, this picture has changed. Geologists today tell us that one day the molten rock at the core of the earth will cool off. The earth will stop rotating on its axis and will lose its magnetic field. When this happens, its protecting atmosphere will be blown off into space by the solar wind, at which point the earth will be uninhabitable, since it will be directly exposed to the dangerous rays of the sun. Astronomers tell us that one day the sun will begin to run out of the fuel that powers it, and it will enter the final stages of its life. When this happens, the sun will rapidly expand, becoming a red giant. It will then engulf and vaporize the earth. Our beloved planet will cease to exist. Sometime after this, the sun itself will breathe its last gasp and will explode in an event called a nova. With this, our solar system will no longer exist. No trace of it will remain, and it will be as if we never existed. In contrast to the earlier view, this picture offers precious little comfort. Indeed, when we think about it a lot, it starts to become somewhat disturbing. In this vast cosmic play of planets, stars, and galaxies, which is larger than one can even imagine and operates on timescales that are inconceivable, what is the meaning of my life? Nothing that I will ever do will change these basic facts. The earth, the sun, they will be destroyed. There's nothing that I or you or all of humanity collectively could do about this. Think of your dearest hopes and dreams, your struggles and achievements, all the things that makes your life important and meaningful to you. Now ask yourself, what do these mean on this cosmic scale? Does the universe care that you want to get a university degree, that you hope to obtain a good job or have a beautiful home? Does the universe care that you have inward doubts and anxieties, that you'll feel pain and suffering? In all of these things, the universe seems cruelly indifferent. As Macbeth says, the sound and fury of all of human life amounts to nothing. Our existence is but a flicker of a brief candle. When we look at things from this modern perspective, then it's easy to take a critical view of the events and customs that make up our daily lives. People who take themselves or the actions in their lives very seriously suddenly seem to have lost perspective. They appear to pursue petty goals in their petty lives, all the while pretending that they're achieving something grand and monumental. They fail to see that, in the end, all of their efforts will amount to nothing. This is the perspective of the modern nihilist, the person who believes that there's no real meaning in the world. Kierkegaard is interested in the problem of the meaninglessness of life. He regards this as an important modern phenomenon that must be taken seriously. In the second part of the concept of irony, he treats different forms of what he calls modern irony. The positions that he looks at are very similar to that of the modern nihilist. So we now turn to this analysis to see what insights it might hold for the modern problem of the absence of meaning in our 21st century world. In the introduction to part 2 of the concept of irony, Kierkegaard reiterates that the goal of the work is to examine the development of irony in its historical forms. As he noted at the beginning of the book, 2 elements are required for this analysis. First, the idea or concept of irony, and second, the actual empirical phenomenon of it. On the one hand, we need the concept so that we can recognize specific instances of it. Without the concept of irony in our minds, it would be impossible for us to determine concrete instances of irony in the world. Just as if we didn't know the concept of dog, we'd be unable to identify which animals in the actual world are dogs. On the other hand, we also need the empirical phenomenon of irony, since without it, our concept or idea of irony would simply float in the air and have no contact with the real world. So Kierkegaard claims that we must continue to operate with the concept of irony, but be sure that we focus on specific instances of it in actuality. The 2 are intertwined. The concept is in the phenomenon, and the phenomenon in the concept. The first phenomenon of irony that was explored in the first part of the work was, of course, that of Socrates. He used irony and introduced the notion of subjectivity into the world. According to Kierkegaard, who's following Hegel on this point, this marked a major step in the development of human thinking. After Socrates, the idea of subjectivity didn't simply disappear. On the contrary, it caught on, and in the course of time became more and more important. People began to realize the significance and value of subjectivity in contrast to the broad sphere of custom and tradition. Kierkegaard now says that in the modern world, a new form of irony is introduced. But it's not identical with Socratic irony. Since Socrates, subjectivity has had several centuries to develop. Now in the modern world, we accept the role of subjectivity in a positive way. This is completely different from the ancient Greeks who, with the exception of Socrates, rejected it. So when irony arises in the modern world, it does so against an entirely different background and with an entirely different point of departure. In each case, irony is an assertion of subjectivity, but since in the modern world subjectivity is already established, it must assert itself in an even more radical manner. Kierkegaard writes, quote, "For a new mode of irony to be able to appear now, it must result from the assertion of subjectivity on a still higher form. It must be subjectivity raised to the second power, a subjectivity's subjectivity, which corresponds to reflection's reflection." Kierkegaard associates modern irony with the movement of German Romanticism, which is represented by figures such as Friedrich von Schlegel, Ludwig Tieck, and Karl Wilhelm Ferdinand Solger. Each of these 3 figures attempted to employ irony in his specific field. Kierkegaard also notes that Hegel had an important criticism of the Romantics, and he wishes to take this into account in his own analysis. It's to these forms of modern irony that Kierkegaard now turns. What do we mean when we refer to German Romanticism? This is an intellectual movement that's difficult to define in a few words since it's so diverse and contains so many different elements. Romanticism is usually thought to be the movement that arose in France, England, and the German states in the second half of the 18th century as a reaction to the Enlightenment. While the Enlightenment focused on the faculty of reason to criticize the church and the reigning political order, that is, absolute monarchy, Romanticism focused on feeling and emotion. The Enlightenment was regarded as the politically progressive force at the time, sweeping away superstition and outdated practices and institutions. But the leading figures of Romanticism found something abstract and sterile in the Enlightenment. The faculty of reason is something that's shared by everyone. We're all able to understand science and mathematics in the same way, since we all possess the faculty of reason. In a sense, my own personal opinion about these things doesn't really matter. They're true independent of me. I can recognize their truth when I employ my reason. According to the Romantics, this means that in order to understand something, I must in effect abstract from myself. In my rational faculty, there's nothing special or unique about me as a specific person. On the contrary, this is what I share with everyone else. The Romantics argue that it's only in feeling and emotion that my true self really emerges. Only I have the specific set of feelings that I possess at any given point in time. This is what is special about the individual and what should be cultivated. By contrast, the Enlightenment's adulation of reason in effect forgets the individual. There's no room left for the individual in the Enlightenment picture. The Romantics, therefore, tried to celebrate individuality. This meant criticizing the Enlightenment emphasis on science and reason. It also meant criticizing different kinds of conformism in society. Therefore, they mounted an aggressive attack on bourgeois life and values. Friedrich von Schlegel, for example, wrote a book titled Lucinda, in which he shocked the middle-class society of the day with his allusions to free sexual acts outside of marriage. The Romantics dreamed of a world in which each individual could express his or her true self. In their criticism of the Enlightenment and mainstream society, the Romantics often made use of irony. On November the 11th, 1802, the Danish philosopher Henrik Steffens began a series of lectures here at Ehlers College in which he introduced the work of the German Romantics to Denmark. These lectures were extremely popular and were attended by some of the leading intellectuals of the Danish Golden Age. The Romantics focus squarely on the value and integrity of the individual. Irony is something that isolates individuals and undermines the social whole. Why is this the case? Kierkegaard points out that the use of irony as a strategic tool is an action that requires considered reflection. The ironist looks at the way most people use language and cunningly interjects irony into this. Kierkegaard claims that there is a certain superiority in this, and that the ironist takes himself to be more clever than the ordinary person, and his use of language with irony is more subtle and sophisticated than ordinary daily speech. The ironist takes joy in using irony and then waiting to see who in the conversation picks up on it. He takes particular joy when other people fail to notice it and take him to be stating his views straightforwardly. He feels superior to them. The ironist is critical of bourgeois life and enjoys ironically criticizing it. He looks down on other people whom he regards as unreflectively caught up in the petty affairs of this kind of life. Unlike them, he believes that he alone sees the hollowness of bourgeois existence and has the courage to expose its shortcomings. Thus, with this disposition and this use of irony, the person is separating himself from most everyone else. He regards himself not as a part of the mainstream, which would mean undermining his individuality, but rather as a loner, an outsider. This is, in his eyes, the only authentic life. The goal with modern irony is in a sense the same as with Socratic irony, to expose people who are complacent or overly confident. The ironist pretends to go along with things when dealing with such people, but all the while he subtly undermines their claims and arrogant dispositions indirectly with irony. So in this way, the ironist, who might be in a less respected position socially, can nonetheless prove himself superior to people who are generally regarded as the pillars of bourgeois society. The ironist thus takes special pleasure in fooling those people who are honored or hold prestigious positions in life. Most people are bound by certain customs and conventions of society. Their actions are in a sense dictated by such things. The ironist, by contrast, rejects all such established customs and conventions. He regards himself as being free from them, since he's seen through their facade of legitimacy. He knows that such things are only traditional or conventional, but have no absolute grounding. This is what Kierkegaard means when he says that actuality loses its validity for the ironist. Since he's seen through such customary practices, he's free to ignore them and act as he pleases. Kierkegaard describes this with Hegel's term, subjective freedom. He writes, I quote, "The salient feature of irony is the subjective freedom that at all times has in its power the possibility of beginning and is not handicapped by earlier situations. Almost all of our behavior follows the pattern of previous behavior in previous situations. As noted, this behavior is governed by customs and traditions. Since the ironist doesn't believe in these, he's free to start anew, ex nihilo, each time. One is subjectively free in a sense that one acts based on one's own decisions and inclinations, and not in accordance with some criterion that comes from without, that is, external custom or tradition." Kierkegaard describes many different forms of irony, but the key one is what he calls irony in the immanent sense. One can be ironic about specific things in one's culture that one finds to be mistaken or wrong. In this way, one aims irony at a specific target, for example, a corrupt institution or a hypocritical individual. But irony in the immanent sense intends to criticize or negate not something specific, but rather everything, that is, an entire culture or way of life. Thus, the German Romantics wanted not just to criticize specific elements of bourgeois life and keep the rest, but rather they wanted to undermine society as a whole. Kierkegaard says that this form of irony, quote, "is directed not against this or that particular existing entity, but against the entire given actuality at a certain time and under certain conditions." He borrows a phrase from Hegel and refers to this form of irony as infinite absolute negativity. Irony is by its very nature something that's critical or negates something. This form of irony is infinite since it's not satisfied to criticize or negate just specific finite things, but rather wants to criticize everything. It's absolute in the sense that it regards everything that it criticizes as merely finite convention. Such conditions are merely relative and have no deeper binding power than human law or custom. By contrast, the ironist's own position is absolute. Indeed, it's the sole absolute that says that there are no absolutes and that all truth is relative. Kierkegaard notes an odd convergence in two standpoints that seem on the face of it to be at the opposite ends of the spectrum, namely the pious religious view and the ironist. One might think that these two views have absolutely nothing to do with one another, since religion represents a part of the traditions and conventions of society that the ironist is constantly trying to undermine. But Kierkegaard enjoins us to look closer. He recalls the words of Ecclesiastes, "Everything is vanity." This view says that all the affairs of human life are vain and transient in comparison to what is really important, namely God. In other words, God is the absolute, and everything else, that is, everything coming from humans, is merely relative and finite. In short, vanity. Irony comes to the same conclusion about the mundane world of human society. It agrees that everything is vanity, but not because it believes that God is the absolute. Instead, its absolute is that there are no absolutes. But what's interesting is that the disposition of both the pious religious believer and the ironists separate them from the mainstream society and daily life in the world, which neither can take seriously. Although the modern ironist seems to be a kind of nihilist that could not be further away from religious belief, this strangely seems to be a case where opposites converge. Like the religious believer, the ironist believes that this truth sets him free, specifically from the tyranny of custom, tradition, and hypocrisy in the world. An important figure for the young Kierkegaard during his days as a student at the University of Copenhagen was a man named Johann Ludwig Heiberg. Heiberg came from an intellectual family, was a leading poet, dramatist, and literary critic in Denmark in the 1830s and 40s. As a child, he lived for a time in this house called the Hill House, which belonged to the literary scholar Knud Lune Rabeck, who was a close friend of Heiberg's father, who had been exiled from the Danish kingdom. Rabeck's home was known as one of the great literary salons of Golden Age Copenhagen. When he was older, Heiberg went to Paris, where he studied French vaudeville, which he brought to the stage of the Royal Theatre in Copenhagen when he came back. He was the editor of the leading journal for aesthetics and criticism of the age called Københavns Flyvende Post, or Copenhagen's Flying Post. It was in this journal that Kierkegaard published his first articles. Heiberg's wife, Johanna Louisa Heiberg, was the leading actress of the day. And Kierkegaard's article, The Crisis and the Crisis in the Life of an Actress, is dedicated to analysis of her art. Heiberg's mother, Thomasina Bunsen, known as Madame Gullenborg, was a popular novelist, and Kierkegaard's work, A Literary Review, examines her novel, Two Ages. Heiberg's many interests also included philosophy, which he used, among other things, to try to ground his theory of aesthetics. Heiberg's philosophical orientation came from his experience with Hegel's philosophy. He learned about Hegel when he was working as a lecturer at the University of Kiel. He became so interested in what he had read that he went to Berlin in 1824 and attended Hegel's lectures. This was an exciting period at the University of Berlin, when Hegel's power was at its height, and he was surrounded by a large number of adoring students who came from all over Europe. Heiberg's first-hand encounter with Hegel was one of the great revelations of his life. He describes this as a kind of epiphany that he experienced on his return from Berlin to Kiel. He writes, and I quote, "While resting on the way home in Hamburg, where I stayed 6 weeks before returning to Kiel, and during that time was constantly pondering what was still obscure to me, it happened one day that, sitting in my room in the End, the König von England, with Hegel on my table and in my thoughts, and listening at the same time to the beautiful hymns which sounded almost unceasingly from the chimes of St. Peter's Church, suddenly, in a way which I have experienced neither before nor since, I was gripped by a momentary inner vision, as if a flash of lightning had illuminated the whole region for me and awakened in me the theretofore hidden central thought. From this moment, the system in its broad outline was clear to me, and I was completely convinced that I had grasped it in its innermost core, regardless of however much there might be in the details that I still had not made my own and perhaps never will." Heiberg returned to Copenhagen and began to make a campaign to introduce Hegel's philosophy to his fellow countrymen. As a part of this campaign, he wanted to give a series of private lectures on the subject. To announce this, he published a short pamphlet in March of 1833 entitled On the Significance of Philosophy for the Present Age. This work presents some of the basics of Hegel's philosophy and issued an invitation for interested students to sign up for the lectures. Heiberg begins the treatise by claiming that the present age is in a state of crisis. According to his Hegelian theory of history, there are different periods or epochs of history, each of which has its own values, traditions, and worldviews. The period offers the people at the time a stable picture of reality that they can use to understand the world and their lives. However, from time to time, as history develops and new ways of thinking and scientific discoveries appear, the stable points of orientation of a given period begin to falter. Then, a period of crisis begins, which results in the collapse of the reigning worldview. In this crisis, people begin to feel uncertain and anxious since they no longer have any firm points on which to base their existence. Heiberg's diagnosis of his own time is that it is in a state of crisis. In the wake of the tumults caused by the Enlightenment at the end of the 18th century, people had lost their belief in traditional institutions and practices. The Enlightenment criticized monarchical power, which had held sway in Europe for centuries. It rejected traditional religious belief as superstition and tried to undermine the power of the church. According to Heiberg, the result of this is subjectivism, relativism, and nihilism. People didn't know what to believe in any longer. He says that a similar crisis took place during the Roman Empire when institutions from past ages continued to exist, but they were empty since no one believed in them any longer. He writes, they were, quote, like a ghost from past ages which had lost all meaning in the present. He explains that in this condition, people, quote, felt abandoned by all gods since the entire world of gods was dead. While he says this about the Roman world, the implication is clear. This is a problem of his own age as well. Heiberg's claim is that in his own day, people had become uncertain about what used to be fixed points of human existence in, for example, religion, art, and philosophy. The age must urgently find a solution before it collapses into a complete relativism and nihilism. This is, for Heiberg, the great challenge of the day. In Kierkegaard's chapter, The World Historical Validity of Irony, he takes up Heiberg's understanding of the development of history through periods of stability and crisis. He follows Heiberg by claiming that the worldviews of the periods of history are transient and mutable. He writes, I quote, the given actuality at a certain time is the actuality valid for the generation and the individuals in that generation. But then, when the old worldviews cease to be plausible, quote, this actuality must be displaced by another actuality, and this must occur through and by individuals and the generation. So just like Heiberg, Kierkegaard claims that the changes in the worldviews take place by individuals ceasing to believe in the key elements that sustain the common culture. His goal is to understand the use of irony historically at times when a given worldview is in crisis. Instead of talking about a worldview of a specific people or period, Kierkegaard uses the words existence and actuality to capture this. He explains the situation of a person using irony in a time when a culture's traditions and values are starting to crumble. In such a situation, quote, the whole of existence has become alien to the ironic subject, and the ironic subject, in turn, alien to existence. And as a result, quote, actuality has lost its validity for the ironic subject. The person using irony does so since he or she feels alienated from mainstream traditions and values. The ironist is able to see that these traditions and values are not firmly grounded and no longer have credibility. If this concerns many different aspects of one's culture, then suddenly one feels alienated from everything and from the actuality of one's time. Kierkegaard points out that there are two aspects of this development. Quote, the new must forge ahead, and, quote, the old must be displaced. There are people in any given age of crisis who perceive the crisis very clearly. Kierkegaard follows Heiberg on this point, since Heiberg separates the intellectuals of the age from the common masses, claiming that the great minds of the period are the ones leading the vanguard of humanity out of the crisis and into the new age. They have some intuition about the new period that will emerge from the crisis. This is what Kierkegaard describes as the prophetic individual. Heiberg calls these people the educated or cultured people, and in his own age, he identifies two figures as the leaders of humanity, urging everyone on to embrace a new worldview, Goethe and Hegel. For Kierkegaard, the ironist is the one who perceives the present crisis clearly. He describes the ironist thus, quote, he battles for the new and strives to destroy what for him is a vanishing actuality. But his task is not so much to destroy as to advance the new and thereby destroy the past indirectly. but the old must be superseded. The old must be perceived in all its imperfection. But the ironist has no clear picture of what the future will hold. He has only vague intuitions. Thus his goal is not to construct that future. He sees only the contradictions of the present and tries to make these clear to other people in order to precipitate the crisis that will lead to the new age. The ironist points to the future without knowing concretely what it is. Kierkegaard follows what Heiberg describes at the beginning of On the Significance of Philosophy for the Present Age, when he talks about the common culture striving, quote, powerfully forward in manifold directions, without anyone really knowing where it will lead. Heiberg talks about the educated and cultivated people of any given period being those who are prophetic in the sense of catching a fleeting glimpse of the new age beyond the ruins of the present. For Kierkegaard, it's precisely from this educated class that the ironist comes. Kierkegaard talks about the ironist as, quote, a sacrifice that the world process demands. By this, he means that in any age of crisis, there will be people who use irony to try to tear away at the decaying structure of the present. Such people will invariably be resented and disdained by those of their contemporaries who try to hold on firmly to the structure. As a result, such prophetic ironists are often subject to persecution. Kierkegaard describes the ironist as negatively free, in the sense that the ironist is freed from the usual demands of custom and tradition. Indeed, the ironist regards the rest of society as unreflective slaves to customary patterns of behavior. There's thus a great sense of liberation to know that one is no longer subject to such constraints of society, and that the wide world of possibility lies open. One can dress, speak, and act in any way that one wishes, and there's no need to conform to the usual social norms. This gives the ironist the sense that there is in fact something new that replaces what's been destroyed. The key for Kierkegaard is that the ironist must feel this sense of freedom vis-a-vis the established order of things. He writes, quote, face to face with the given actuality, the subjectivity feels its power, its validity and meaning. This is what Hegel referred to as subjective freedom. One must realize the absolute and irreducible value of the individual and its rights. This is not something that's simply given, but rather it develops historically. Our understanding of what human beings are as individuals has changed radically over time, and the principle of subjective freedom has come to be realized. This leads Kierkegaard in a key passage to conclude, quote, insofar as this irony is world historically justified, the subjectivity's emancipation is carried out in the service of the idea. So for Kierkegaard, the point of irony is not simply to make fun of people or to engage in irony for its own sake. Instead, the justification for irony from a historical perspective is that it is used to focus on and develop the principle of subjective freedom. It is in the service of this idea. This was the mission of Socrates. Indeed, it was Hegel's interpretation that Socrates was the first to begin to develop subjective freedom historically. Hegel contrasts Socratic irony and the irony of the German Romantics. And here we see a key idea behind Kierkegaard's work, The Concept of Irony, which provides an analysis and comparison of exactly these two forms of irony. Hegel points out that while the Romantics turned to Socrates to justify their use of irony, this use is quite different from that of Socrates himself. In his lectures, Hegel associates Romantic irony with Friedrich von Schlegel, the philologist Friedrich Ast, and the philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte, all three of whom are discussed by Kierkegaard in his work. According to Hegel, these authors wish to use irony as a purely negative tool to tear down any idea, custom, belief, institution, tradition, and so forth. In other words, irony can be used in the service of relativism or nihilism to criticize anything and everything. The Romantics have extended the Socratic principle to a universal one. But for Hegel, Socrates' goal was not to destroy for the sheer joy of destroying, but rather in order to reach the truth. For Hegel, it's a mistake to understand Socrates as the originator of this kind of irony. It's true that Socrates placed the focus on the individual and subjectivity, but this was very different from the understanding of subjectivity in the Romantics. Hegel's critical of the Romantics since he sees them as relativists who simply try to assert their own whimsical views and opinions in opposition to accepted custom and tradition. Hegel imagines an advocate of this position who says, quote, "It's I who through my educated thoughts can annul all determinations of right, morality, good, etc., because I am clearly master of them, and I know that if anything seems good to me, I can easily subvert it because things are only true to me insofar as they please me now." The Romantic can also change his view at will when it no longer continues to please him. While it's true that for Socrates the individual must reach the truth for him or herself, this doesn't mean that the truth is something that's arbitrary or relative to each individual. It doesn't justify a self-satisfied enjoyment of one's own private truth at the expense of a publicly accepted one. Socrates doesn't arrogantly believe that his views are superior to those of other people. Unlike the Romantics, he doesn't openly mock accepted custom and tradition. Hegel thus concludes that Socrates' irony is, quote, "a manner of speech, a pleasant rallying," or, in the translation of Kierkegaard's quotation of it in the concept of irony, "a manner of conversation, sociable pleasantry." This stands in contrast to the Romantics' satirical laughter or pretense, which treats the idea as though it, quote, "were nothing but a joke." Kierkegaard then turns to Hegel's treatment of irony. He points out that Hegel's generally a quite consistent critic of irony, especially in its modern form in the German Romantics. Indeed, Hegel's highly polemical in his treatment of figures such as Friedrich von Schlegel. Kierkegaard seems to have a mixed assessment of this. On the one hand, he agrees with Hegel's criticism of these figures as relativists and takes Hegel to have performed an important service by criticizing them. He writes, quote, "It's one of Hegel's great merits that he halted, or at least wanted to halt, the prodigal sons of speculation on their way to perdition." But then, on the other hand, he thinks that Hegel is overly critical of the Romantics, and this leads him to fail to see the truth of irony. Kierkegaard thinks that since Hegel has no patience whatsoever for romantic irony, he is unable to distinguish this from other forms of irony. In short, Hegel throws together all forms of irony into one negative idea, which he proceeds to criticize. But by doing so, he fails to appreciate Socratic irony, which is a different form of irony. Kierkegaard thinks that Hegel completely misses the point with Socrates' irony when he describes it as merely a manner of conversation, sociable pleasantry. This fails to recognize the deeper underlying point of Socrates' use of irony. Kierkegaard's main criticism is that Hegel in the end ascribes something positive to Socrates. In other words, for Hegel, the goal of Socrates' irony was simply to start up a discussion that would lead to a determination of the concept or the universal. But Kierkegaard claims that Socrates is negativity through and through. His goal is not to construct something, but rather to negate. It's important to appreciate just how counterintuitive Kierkegaard's position is here. Usually, if there's a problem, our immediate instinct is to try to solve it. If there's a question of a concept, then our goal is to try to define it. We're uncomfortable in remaining in a situation with unresolved problems or uncertain situations. We naturally want to try to resolve them. But Kierkegaard's position is just the opposite of this. For Kierkegaard, resolving something or constructing something is not beneficial to the individual. Rather, it's a terrible disservice. If you cure doubt or assuage the pain of nihilism by supplying an answer, you rob the individual of his own subjective responsibility to search for the truth. This is even worse if what you construct as truth isn't even true, which is what Kierkegaard regarded the sophists to be doing in Socrates' time, and what he regarded the priests and the academics to be doing in his own time. Kierkegaard's Socrates is negative, that is, in a sense, a nihilist, but that's all right. This frees the subject to search for the truth subjectively. The key difference between Kierkegaard's Socrates and Kierkegaard's Romantics is that Socrates doesn't stop the search or cynically make up the truth like Kierkegaard's Romantics. As we know, Kierkegaard's The Concept of Irony attempts to trace the use of irony historically. In other words, he wishes to understand how and when irony arose and how it developed over time. Today, this kind of study would fall under the heading History of Ideas. Kierkegaard's work is something of a hybrid. On the one hand, it's not a purely historical work, since Kierkegaard isn't interested in history per se. He's not tracing kings, wars, expeditions of discovery, and things of that sort. On the other hand, it's not a purely conceptual work either. He's not interested just in the concept of irony on its own, separated from its historical context. His work rather involves both elements, and this is what he discusses in his introduction. First, there's the element of the historical phenomenon, that is, the concrete use of irony by the concrete person Socrates in ancient Athens. This involves understanding Socrates in the context of the ancient Greek world and the Athenian city-state. So there's an empirical element here that's based on the extant sources of Socrates' life and thought, Plato, Xenophon, and Aristophanes. But second, there's also a conceptual element, or an element of thought involved. History isn't simply a catalog of raw data that's repeated to the reader for immediate consumption. Rather, the sources need to be interpreted. Situations and events must be reconstructed, and connections must be inferred. Certain things need to be judged to be central and important, while others are disregarded and cast aside as irrelevant and unimportant. This is the work of the historian. In order to do this work, one must invariably make use of certain ideas, concepts, or organizational schemes to facilitate one's interpretations of the events. Kierkegaard points out that both of these elements are required to approach subject matter of this kind. It would be absurd to bury oneself in the empirical phenomena alone and leave it at that, since this would not be illuminating in any way. The empirical data needs interpretation before it can be meaningful. Likewise, it would be absurd to focus exclusively on the conceptual side without even giving a look to the empirical phenomena, since this would end in complete abstraction, and the analysis would, so to speak, float in the air away from actual existence and reality. One needs both particularity, the raw empirical data of history, and universality, the idea or concepts. Kierkegaard associates the empirical side with history and the conceptual side with philosophy. He recognizes the importance of both for his study. And I quote, "Both of them ought to have their rights so that, on the one hand, the phenomenon has its rights and is not to be intimidated and discouraged by philosophy's superiority, and philosophy, on the other hand, is not to let itself be infatuated by the charms of the particular, is not to be distracted by the superabundance of the particular." So for Kierkegaard, both sides have their validity, and both are necessary for the kind of study that he's presenting. This is worth noting, since Kierkegaard is often characterized as someone who's anti-conceptual, or someone who celebrates existence and actuality while rejecting all forms of abstraction and theory. But here it's clear that he values ideas and concepts, but he simply believes that they must be grounded in experience or concrete phenomena. Thus, the work is called not the empirical phenomenon of irony, but rather the concept of irony. In his overview of Hegel's understanding of Socrates, Kierkegaard criticizes Hegel for placing too much emphasis on the concept and not enough on the empirical phenomenon. He reproaches Hegel for not being philologically exacting in the sense that he doesn't make a close study of all the relevant sources, but instead is too quick to focus on the general concept in abstraction from its concrete historical grounding. Kierkegaard implies that Hegel isn't as concerned as he should be about the details of history, but rather tries simply to give the big picture. Hegel's not worried that perhaps not all of the details from the sources fit into this big picture. He caricatures Hegel as the commander-in-chief of world history who just takes a royal glimpse at things before moving along. Kierkegaard believes that this leads to a distortion of the interpretation of Socrates. He thinks that Hegel's view fails to recognize the inconsistencies in the accounts of Socrates given by the ancient sources. Since Hegel observes Socrates, so to speak, from a bird's eye view, he fails to see some important details about the person of Socrates, which can't be reduced to a part of some grand historical narrative. I'm joined here by Professor Heiko Schulz from the Faculty of Theology at the Goethe University in Frankfurt in Germany. Professor Schulz is one of the leading experts on Kierkegaard's relation to German philosophy and theology in the 1830s and 40s. He's done extensive work on the reception of the philosophy of Hegel and his students in Kierkegaard's writings. He's currently in charge of an ambitious German translation project of Kierkegaard's writings. Professor Schulz, Kierkegaard claims that his analysis of irony takes into account the abstract concept and the concrete historical phenomenon. He criticizes Hegel's account of Socrates and Socratic irony for placing too much emphasis on the concept and for not being philologically exacting with regard to the historical side. How do you understand this criticism?
Well, how do I understand the basic idea underlying his criticism, namely the idea of a relation between the concrete historical phenomenon and the concept? It seems to me that both Hegel and Kierkegaard want to point out, when we talk about a world historical person, a world historical subject such as Socrates, we could differentiate between these two aspects. Socrates actually was acting as an individual, a historical individual, talking to people. So there are very many aspects and details belonging to his historical concretion, so to speak. And that's part of what Kierkegaard calls the historical phenomenon. But at the same time, of course, Socrates is a world historical individual. That means he's representing or bringing out or bringing about some world historically decisive idea or concept in the Hegelian terms. And it seems to me that Kierkegaard shares this basic assumption with Hegel, shares the assumption that we have to bring in both aspects and both details, and maybe that there's a certain dialectic going on between the concrete historical phenomenon and the concept carried or represented by it. So much for their common convictions with regard to this point. Now Kierkegaard seems to complain in relation to Hegel that Hegel undervalued the historical side, the concrete side, by going or by moving over into the conceptual side all too quickly. And to a certain extent, I would agree to this, because Hegel is just interested in the idea, or seems to be just interested in the idea that Socrates is representing or bringing about.
Yeah, but then, given that Kierkegaard himself makes use of exactly this methodology, do you think that this is a fair criticism?
To a certain extent, I would say it is not fair. So, as I said already, they share basic methodological assumptions. They share the basic dialectic between the historical phenomenon and the concept, but Kierkegaard seems to want to say that Hegel undervalues the concrete historical phenomenon of Socrates. Why does he think so? Well, because he's of the opinion there's something very specific about this historical phenomenon of Socrates. And what is this very specific aspect? It is a combination of irony and of having a deep felt and basic interest in the good. And both Hegel and Kierkegaard agree upon this, the historical function of Socrates of being the founder of morality, if only in this very restricted respect that he sort of founded the principle of human conscience and other things. But Kierkegaard's problem is, how does this function, or how this idea or this concept of the Socratic role, how does it relate to his historical acting in a very ironic way? At least in as much as we know from Plato's dialogues and other sources. So how does this relate to one another? How does it fit together? Being ironic on the one hand, and being basically interested in the good in an ethical sense. And but that's a specific Kierkegaardian problem, it seems to me, which he unfolds in the concept of irony. But now he complains over against Hegel that he does not give a satisfying solution of the problem. And my impression is Hegel doesn't give any satisfying solution because it is not his problem. So in that sense, it seems that the criticism is unfair. It's not that they both give a description and a solution, and one is convincing or not. The fact is that Hegel doesn't have the same problem, and so it's very natural that he doesn't come up with any solution.
Kierkegaard's second criticism of Hegel has to do with Hegel's understanding of Socrates as the founder of morality. Hegel's telling a long story about the development of philosophy in Western culture. He sees Socrates as playing an important role in this development, since he was the first person to realize the importance of subjective freedom. This meant that morality was not just about what was already fixed and given outwardly by one's culture, but rather it was something that was inward and concerned one's own thoughts, considerations, and conscience. This was a positive principle that entered into history at this time. According to Hegel, this was an important step in the development of human culture, and this form of morality is one of the characteristic features of the modern world. Kierkegaard is critical of this since he thinks that it's a mistake to ascribe some positive principle to Socrates. It's a mistake to think that Socrates founded some school of philosophy or some social movement. Instead, Kierkegaard wants to insist that Socrates' service historically was entirely negative. He critically dismantled the pretension of the sophists in the mainstream Athenian citizen. On the one hand, he showed the hollowness of the relativism of the sophists, and on the other hand, he pointed out that the ideas that his fellow Athenians prided themselves on were baseless and couldn't stand the test of rational examination. But in both cases, Socrates' contribution is a negative one. He doesn't, at the end, present some positive view of his own, either to the sophists or to his fellow citizens. He simply leaves the matter without resolution. At the end, there's negation or aporia, but no solution. Kierkegaard says that we need to hold fast to this picture of Socrates and resist the urge of historians or philosophers to incorporate him into some larger narrative about the development of the history of philosophy in a positive way. Hegel has mistakenly attributed to Socrates a positive role as looking forward to and anticipating later developments. But the truth of the matter is that Socrates was not forward-looking, but rather backward-looking. Socrates was responding to individuals and institutions that already existed and criticizing them. But this is where it stopped. He was making a negative statement about Greek culture and thought at the time, but he never managed to find the truth or to present something positive for later ages to build upon. Socrates claims to be seeking the good, that is, the concept of the good. He's constantly asking people for a definition of this, and he's given answers that reflect Athenian values and views. One by one, he undermines all of these and shows how none of the definitions seems to be consistent. While both Kierkegaard and Hegel agree on this, Kierkegaard's point is that the focus should be on the eternal search for the good and not arriving at it. Kierkegaard thus focuses on Socrates' irony as a defining feature, since this irony is purely negative. It tears down in the sense that it's critical of specific theses, doctrines, definitions, etc., but it doesn't build up. There's no positive element in it. Kierkegaard's account of the Romantics and modern irony sounds like an interesting chapter in the history of ideas. But is this really meaningful in any way at all for our modern world today? Do we really care about what Kierkegaard had to say about long-forgotten German authors like Tieck and Solger? Let's think for a moment about who we are and our role in the modern life. All of you many online students come from different parts of the world with different customs and values. Each and every one of you has an idea or a conception of yourself. Take a moment and reflect on what that is. When you look at yourself in the mirror and ask, who am I? What kind of an answer do you give yourself? Our problem in the modern world is that as soon as we try to articulate who we are, we immediately run into the problem that there are many other people who share exactly the same characteristics that we do. When I say, for example, that I'm a person who enjoys reading about philosophy or a person who's interested in the thought of Søren Kierkegaard, then I've not really said anything that could define who I am as an individual, since there are many other people in the world, probably most all of you, thousands of online students who share exactly these same properties. It then becomes a more urgent question to determine what it is that makes me uniquely who I am. We often identify ourselves by our clothes, our styles, and possessions. But take a moment and consider this. When I look at myself, I see that I'm wearing this shirt, these pants, these shoes, but none of these things is uniquely mine. All of these are mass-produced, and if I were to go outside onto the street, it probably wouldn't take me too long to find people wearing exactly the same shirt, exactly the same pants, exactly the same shoes. In the old days, before mass production, articles like this were made by craftsmen. Each one of these articles was unique, and individuals who possessed them had literally something that was one of a kind. By contrast, since the Industrial Revolution, virtually everything is made in mass quantities by machines. The world today is made, as it were, by cookie cutter machines that produce everything around us in preset forms. The danger is that each of us has become just one more product of this machine. Think of Andy Warhol's famous picture of the Campbell's soup tomato cans lined up one on top of another. This is an image of modernity. The fear of many of us is that we might become like one of these soup cans. Some people have an urge deep within to revolt against this and to assert their individuality in the face of this kind of conformity. Think of all the ways people try to be different from everyone and express something unique about themselves. Some people dye their hair an odd or striking color, or get a tattoo or pierce some unusual part of their body. But these gestures, while at first radical, also seem to fall short, since in a very short time they are also copied by others, and soon a trend starts, and the result is, again, the same. So many people are doing the same thing that nothing unique or individual is really being expressed. This is our problem in the 21st century, and one that we can see that the Romantics back in Kierkegaard's time already saw coming more than 2 centuries ago. They struggled to assert the value of the individual against the forces of conformity, but they couldn't have imagined the challenges that would come. It is these challenges that we face today. We feel quite convinced that there is something special and unique that makes us who we are. But what is this, and how can we express it? When we fail to answer these questions, we feel disoriented and lost in the world. We feel lost since we can take no consolation in the community or social group, since they undermine our individuality and make us into faceless members of a larger whole. This is the modern problem, where each individual is left to him or herself. So again, ask yourself, who are you really? Of 7 billion human beings on the planet, what makes you that unique person you are? you.